Is the Washington Post Russian propaganda now? That's the source I use to show people that the vast majority of Crimeans wanted to join Russia when they annexed Crimea in 2014. Is the United States National Science Foundation, a .gov website, also Russian propaganda now too? Because that government-funded poll was the source that I used to show that the majority of Crimeans still wanted to be a part of Russia even in 2019. 82% of Crimeans and 58% of the ethnic minority of Turkic Muslim Tatars still approved of Russian leadership even in 2019. Is Vice News Russian propaganda too? I didn't think so when I was watching their very anti-Russian documentaries, but they happen to show a large amount of pro-Russian sentiment in those eastern Ukrainian territories where they were investigating.
Seems like there's a lot of pro-Russian sentiment here, and it's hard to tell whether it's genuine or whether these people have just sensed that the winds of change are coming through town.
Is the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, also Russian propaganda? Because they did a piece like 1 month before the invasion of Ukraine, and it showed, they talked about the thousands of Ukrainians who were killed there by Ukrainian forces in this civil war.
Between Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian military, it still lies in ruin. More than 14,000 people have been killed on both sides.
I don't know what I'm allowed to use as a source. Clearly not the UN, who are the ones who provided the figure of over 14,000 deaths in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022. That's before the Russian invasion. 14,000 people were killed, including over 3,000 civilians. The famously pro-Russian United Nations can't trust those guys. Those are Putin apologists, apparently. And now you want to say that UNICEF is pro-Russian propaganda too, because they're the ones saying that there's no evidence that Russia is kidnapping children in Ukraine.
Does UNICEF have any evidence of Ukrainian children being taken to Russia against their will?
We have heard the same reports, but have no evidence ourselves, and we're certainly willing to look into it and assist in any way we can, but we have no evidence as such.
UNICEF wants to remain neutral in order to negotiate with both sides in order to best serve the immediate needs of these children, and they've determined that Ukraine is not a safe place for children at this time, so they need to negotiate where the children can go. I don't know the full story of this one, so this is the one thing I will say don't completely take my word on, but from what I can understand, these are Russian children living in Ukraine, and their homes become a war zone, so Russia takes them in because they would be vilified if they left children in a war zone. They also get vilified if they take children out of a war zone. Apparently, the children have been returned since then, and it's not kidnapping to these people here who are Russian now. Hey, take it up with UNICEF. They're the pro-Russian propagandists, apparently. Now, I will be the first to say that I don't think it's fair to hold a referendum under military occupation, like what was done in Crimea, what was done in eastern Ukraine, where 85, 95, 98% of some of these territories voted to join Russia, allegedly. So that's why I don't understand how you say you're pro-democracy, Ukrainian nationalists, and then you didn't let these places vote. Kyiv and the UN blocked the referendums in those territories and didn't allow them to vote. On the subject of democracy, I think that is so rich coming from the people who supported violently overthrowing the president of Ukraine in 2014, where police officers were killed, protesters were killed. It was a bloodbath. Now, I know for a fact that the majority of you were not made aware that Ukraine has suspended its presidential elections because of the war. That is not democracy. Stop saying that this is a war for democracy. And I guess the Associated Press is now pro-Russian propaganda for reporting on that story. Now we need to throw Democracy Now! Into the mix of pro-Russian propaganda outlets because they reported on a pro-peace Ukrainian activist in Ukraine who was prosecuted by Ukraine for being pro-peace. Here comes the part that I shouldn't even have to say. But I am also not a fan of the Russian government. Russia is a conservative capitalist hellscape right now with a lot of corruption going on. But do you know who else has a lot of these problems? Ukraine. They have literal neo-Nazi militias forming since 2014. It is really not good. We're just dumping weapons into these far-right nationalists groups' hands. This is how the Taliban started in Afghanistan because we were funding a proxy war there as well. We were funding the nationalist far-right groups in Afghanistan to fight the Russians. They got a lot of weapons and a lot of power and training from the US, and then they formed the Taliban and took over. A similar thing could happen in Ukraine if we just keep dumping weapons there because the liberals are all leaving. The nationalists, the people who will die for their nation, are the ones staying and fighting. And they will have all the weapons and the power when this war's over. Now let's talk about the end of the war because there are kind of two options. There's not going to be a World War III. Nuclear weapons exist now. So if the US keeps escalating, this could be it for humanity. This is the closest we've been to nuclear Armageddon in decades. Option two is that Ukraine surrenders before that level of escalation, and they're left with an unpayable amount of debt to the EU and the US. Guess what they're going to have to do? They're going to have to sell off all of their publicly owned things. All of their cooperative farms will be sold to these multinational conglomerates who want to have a slice of the breadbasket of the world. Ukraine has a 0% chance of defeating Russia militarily. Let's be really serious right now. This is a proxy war by the West and NATO to hurt Russia. We want this to be as expensive as possible. And guess what? We got to bomb the Russian pipeline that was going into Germany. That was a freebie. Absolutely zero consequences to that act of blatant terrorism. Really convenient for all those oil oligarchs who basically run our country. Every war we've been in the past few decades has been about oil. So I find it really crazy that the pro-Ukrainian side are the ones who want to put all the Ukrainian military into a meat grinder and sacrifice them. Endless bloodshed, just so we can hurt Russia a little bit economically for our oligarchy here at home so they don't have to compete with them. I am more pro-Ukrainian than you guys because I want Ukrainians to stop dying for nothing. But while we're talking about sovereignty and democracy in Ukraine, the US committed genocide after genocide during the Cold War and threw everything it had at the USSR to try to bring it to its knees for decades. That's not respecting sovereignty. This graphic shows just the executions, not the millions of deaths from the genocidal wars the US conducted during the Cold War. So these are suspected communists killed usually without trial. We have almost 100,000 in South America alone. 200,000 indigenous people killed in Guatemala. We have 50,000 in Nicaragua. And I want to also point out that the U.S. sided with South Africa during the Cold War in order to fight the communists in Angola and to spread their apartheid politics. We intervened in Sudan, in Iraq, and Iran, Thailand, Indonesia. We killed 1 million suspected communist political opponents. 1 million. East Timor, 300,000. South Korea, we slaughtered student protesters. We executed over 100,000 political opponents in South Korea in order to establish democracy there, and 50,000 executions in Vietnam on top of the million plus from the Vietnam War. And ever since then, the capitalist West has been pushing its influence militarily, economically, and politically eastward throughout Eastern Europe, and they want to put military stuff on Russia's border. They want to aim nukes at Russia, at Moscow, right from its border. Ukraine was hastily turned into a country in 1991. These were the borders of states, and a lot of Russians lived in the eastern part of Ukraine, and now tensions have been flaring up because the U.S. has been meddling and supporting all these pro-democracy, anti-Russian groups in Ukraine for years, and we have a war, and we have tens of thousands of deaths. Every source I used in this video has been vehemently anti-Russian since the start of the war in Ukraine. I will link all of these sources on a webpage on my website. Check it out if you feel so inclined. I really encourage people to do more research about this, look into these themes that we're not being told about, like the civil war that's been going on in the Donbass from 2014 to 2022. Please look into these things more. I want people to be talking about this, even if they disagree with me. I'm happy to have conversations with people who disagree with me. So just remember, these are the same people who have been lying to us about Israel for decades. They're lying to us about Ukraine as well.